work together internationally to develop global solar supply chains. And with that, I wanted to start with an opening message from the Honorable Kevin Rudd, who's recorded a video message to share with us.
Dear friends and colleagues, let me start by thanking the International Solar Alliance and Director General Dr. Ajay Mathur for this kind invitation. It's my great pleasure to join you all virtually during this special occasion at COP27. We're now a few years into the decisive decade. According to the science, we must peak global emissions by 2025 and slash them in half by 2030. The speed of clean energy development will be vital to accelerate mitigation across the board. Solar PV power generation is an important pillar of the global clean energy transition. The International Solar Alliance is playing a central role globally, including by setting out key targets like mobilizing $1 trillion of investments for solar energy solutions and installing 1,000 gigawatts of solar energy capacity by 2030. This is good stuff. Supply chain resilience will be critical for meeting these targets. Yet various economic and geopolitical crises have put enormous pressure on global energy supply chains, leading to soaring prices in essential minerals that are needed for clean energy production. I would thus like to say a few words on this key issue, that is the urgency of expanding and diversifying the global production of solar panels. Within our world today, China's solar photovoltaic industry chain has established and maintained a leading position, both in terms of manufacturing and technology. China has also played an important role in lowering the cost of solar PV globally over the past 10 years. However, on the other side of the coin, the concentration of global supply chains also potentially poses a series of challenges and vulnerabilities. By 2025, it's estimated that the world will depend almost entirely on China to supply key building blocks for solar panel production. This is not a good thing for the world, whether it's China or any other country. High commodity prices and bottlenecks in supply chains have also led to an increase in solar panel prices of about 20% in the last year. These challenges have caused delays for solar panel deliveries worldwide. Globally, policies to support solar PV have focused primarily on increasing demand and reducing costs. However, resilient and sustainable supply chains are also needed to ensure timely and low-cost delivery of solar panels across the globe. The scale of solar deployment required by 2030 represents a massive opportunity for us all. We must constructively grow the pie by expanding and diversifying production, rather than fighting over the existing pieces. This will create jobs and enhance economic development right across the world, especially in countries that seize this moment now. We must therefore continue working together to promote cross-country and cross-continent solutions for solar PV supply chains. This includes sharing technology and expertise, as well as promoting research and innovation and production processes. And we must not forget developing countries, many of which have incredible solar potential given their geography, but which has not yet been tapped. We must support them to address the twin interrelated challenges of lack of manufacturing capacity and lack of solar deployment. This will increase their climate resilience while also enhancing livelihoods. I know from my own experience as Prime Minister in Australia that good policy can incentivise innovation. When I legislated a mandatory renewable energy target in 2009, renewables stood at less than 4% of Australia's total electricity supply. But just this past month, renewable energy generation contributed as much as over 2/3 of power on Australia's main grid, hitting a new record. Around 1/3 of the grid's power came from distributed solar on a single day. It shows you what good policy can do. What's more, research commissioned by the High-Level Policy Commission on Getting Asia to Net Zero, which I chair, shows that increasing climate ambition in Asia and key countries can enhance economic development and bolster energy security. Solar production and deployment is one critical domain that will help us build a livable and resilient future. It demands decisive and coordinated action globally. I thank you.
All right, so it's great to hear that message and call to action. And with that, I want to welcome Dr. Arnab Ghosh to speak about the actions that India has been taking over the past couple of years. That's fine. Go ahead, right here.
Hope you can hear me. Thank you so much. Thank you to the International Solar Alliance for organizing this very important session. As the Honorable Kevin Rudd just said, we need to grow the pie rather than fight over the crumbs. So what do we need to do? Now, when last year India announced the net zero targets for 2070, what it translates to is 5,630 gigawatts of solar for India alone by 2070. So the exponential rise in solar that we've seen over the last decade, when we had less than 20 megawatts to now 60,000 megawatts, itself will feel like a very tiny part of this overall revolution that has to come about. And if the pie is going to grow that big, you've got to figure out how do you actually build in the resilient supply chains that Honorable Kevin Rudd was also talking about. Now today, India has about 20 gigawatts of solar module manufacturing capacity and 4 gigawatts of cell manufacturing capacity, and no capacity for wafers and polysilicon manufacturing. By the end of this decade, or perhaps even sooner, we expect this capacity to increase to more than 100 gigawatts of module manufacturing capacity. Now, how will this happen? To understand this, we have to understand first, what did India prioritize? When the solar mission began, in 2010, we prioritized deployment because we wanted to make sure that every new megawatt of power that came on board was as clean as it could get. And that's why we capitalized on the lower costs of technology, but provided the market incentives of reverse auctions, clear policy direction, ramping up of targets, driving down the prices, increasing market competition, and ensuring that we get to the 60 gigawatts of capacity. But as we build out further, and not just solar, as we build out round-the-clock capacity with a solar and wind hybrid, as we build out green hydrogen, India's green hydrogen targets are larger than any major economy for this decade. The drive for local manufacturing is going to be critical. So as a result, now we have taken a slightly different or a nuanced approach. So while the deployment will keep carrying on, we will also look at building up that domestic manufacturing base, but also be part of a global resilient supply chain for solar products. How are we doing this? First, on the tariff side, basic customs duty was announced a year in advance that gave some breathing room to the domestic manufacturers and the developers to adjust to this new reality. But that wasn't it. Second, the nodal ministry, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, created a list of manufacturers who were eligible to supply the modules for most of the solar projects. And thirdly, and this is the exciting part, is the new introduction of the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, the PLI scheme. Now, the PLI scheme in India is being promoted for 13 different sectors, but for solar manufacturing alone, this is a $3 billion story, which is to incentivize the manufacturing of solar cells modules, as well as polysilicons, and to localize about 75 to 90% of the manufacturing value chain. A combination of these three different incentives, along with the market potential of another 200 gigawatts of solar to be deployed over the course of this decade, means that we will very quickly ramp up this domestic manufacturing capacity while not slowing down the deployment capacity that is needed. So as I close out, what is the lesson here for ramping up solar manufacturing for ISA member countries? Number one, we've got to recognize that you've got to think about the future, not about today, because today, given the state of energy markets, there is a little bit of an overcapacity in terms of supply versus demand. You also have to think about that this growth in the market will be driven by a significant competition on cost. The third mantra is to focus on the supply chains that are gradually expanding to other countries. The concentration that is existing in China today will expand to many other countries. So how do different ISA member countries become part of that resilient supply chain? Fourth, recognize that technology is changing. New types of module technologies, which currently are only about 10% of production, will become about 50% of production by 2030. So bet on the technologies or the emerging technologies of the future. And finally, focus on the upstream as well as the vertical sections of the supply chain. So to reduce so while global overcapacity may have led to reduced investments in downstream manufacturing, we can still create value on the upstream side, especially on balance of materials and so forth. So the key message that I want to leave you with is very similar to what Prime Minister Kevin Rudd outlined. The good policy design can actually trigger or catalyze markets that don't exist. We catalyzed the solar deployment market, and now we are catalyzing the solar manufacturing story, along with the story around green hydrogen, along with the story around electric mobility. So let's learn these lessons, co-share these lessons, and see what we can do together, as is the mission of the International Solar Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arnav Ghosh from CEW. We really appreciate you taking the time for those remarks. I know you have to run, but thank you so much. Okay, and so with that, I think continuing on our whirlwind tour of the world, I'd like to invite Mr. Dries Ake from Solar Power Europe to present the views on the policy landscape in Europe. And why don't you make a little bit of small talk and introduce yourself while I set up the laptop.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm asked to do a bit of small talk while Alexander prepares a presentation. I took some slides with me because I think it's good to visualize a couple of things. It will help you understand my key messages. So yeah, I'm sure that will come soon. Maybe I can already introduce myself. So my name is Dries Ake. I'm the policy director at Solar Power Europe. What is Solar Power Europe? We're the main trade association, the main industry body of solar in Europe, which means that we represent the entire value chain and all of the major players and the smaller players in Europe on solar across the value chain. So from raw materials to manufacturers to deployments to balancing systems. We are mostly European. We have a board that consists of 90% of European companies as well. So that is what is driving us. Thank you, Alexander. Yep. So that's what I just mentioned, a little introduction on Solar Power Europe. Maybe just to continue with the flow of today, solar is booming. It is booming everywhere, and it's also booming in Europe. We heard some astronomical numbers today already this morning as well. In Europe, we're getting there too. We had a record year this year. I think we were close to more than 40 gigawatts of newly installed solar PV in 2020, which is in line with our projections, the high end of the scenario, the yellow bars. So we believe that we're on track with that high end scenario going forward as well, which would basically mean that in a couple of years, in 2026 already, the European market will be a 100 gigawatts market and likely to continue further, which would mean that by 2030, in Europe, we'll have around 1 terawatts, so 1,000 gigawatts of installed solar PV. So that, of course, requires us to think about supply chains. We are quite optimistic about these deployment figures because we had quite a game-changing piece of policy in Europe, which is called the solar strategy. So in May from this year, the European Union published its first solar strategy, which really talked about solar ambition. It talked about solar rooftops, yeah, like mandating rooftop solar on commercial, industrial, residential buildings, new and existing over the next years. It also talked about permitting rules for deployment, kind of accelerating that, which is a key bottleneck in Europe. It also talked about an export credit strategy for solar to the rest of the world. And then the last point was also to talk about the supply chain. Yeah? So the EU has launched or is about to launch a Solar PV Industry Alliance, which is meant to accelerate EU manufacturing and with a target of 30 gigawatts by 2025, of course, within a wider global supply chain diversification strategy. So this is the main game changer. So not only are we accelerating deployments, for the first time there was also a recognition and a target that Europe needs to bring back, reshore a certain part of the supply chain to Europe. So it's a new agenda that we're very happy about. So 30 gigawatts by 2025 of manufacturing across the supply chain. What does it actually mean? What does it actually look like? Well, if you look here at the color coding is not so obvious. Yeah? If you look at the yellow parts of that, we see that Europe has some module manufacturing, quite a lot, up to 10 gigawatts, cells as well, waves and ingots, but at a much lower scale. Of course, we're quite big on polysilicon. There's a company called Wacker, as you know, in Europe. Now, most of that polysilicon is actually just shipped to China and then comes back in assembled products later on. Yeah. So the main issue that Europe has is not just to increase the module and the cells manufacturing to the line of 30 gigawatts, but to do the same on the ingots and the wafers as well. Yeah. And that is, of course, something that is hard in Europe because we have a major competitive disadvantage in Europe, and that's around operational expenditures, electricity costs. So that's quite a tough nut to crack. But you can see 30 gigawatts is pretty ambitious to reach in 3.5 years at best, actually. Still, we are seeing some kind of a renaissance in Europe on solar manufacturing. There is a positive dynamic ongoing already. We have seen quite a lot of new announcements in recent months. For example, from players like Enel, Meyer Burger, REC, also on the ingots side, the more difficult ones in Norway with Norwegian Crystal. So yeah, there is a certain drumbeat, there is a positive dynamic. Now, of course, something has happened, and that is that there's increased competition from around the world. Yeah. So the early positive dynamics that we saw are still there in Europe, but they are being challenged, or at least there's additional competition arising, not just from China, but also from the US and from India. I don't think I need to explain in detail what the PLI scheme was, as you just heard, or the Inflation Reduction Act, but these are assertive industrial policies on solar manufacturing that is creating waves in Europe in terms of what do you prioritize if you're a company. Do you go first to India, first to US, and what does that mean for this initial solar renaissance, manufacturing renaissance that we did see? It means that Europe needs to step up. That's the bottom line. Europe needs an ambitious solar PV industrial strategy at par, or at least with the same kind of credibility and assertiveness and scale as India and the US. And in the end, it's a big puzzle. Yeah, as an industrial strategy on solar is not, there's no silver bullet. You have to tick a couple of boxes. You need to think about CapEx investment support. You need to think about competitive business environment, especially from the operational expenditure side. You need to think as well on the demand pool. You need to put high sustainability standards, a strong demand pipeline in general. So it's actually a puzzle of different pieces that need to work together before you can actually say that you have an incredible industrial strategy. And Europe has some of that. Yeah, we have an EU fund called the Innovation Fund that is there for clean technology manufacture. We have, for example, rules on CO2 footprints, which are also included in tenders that can be a good demand pool. But overall, this picture is not complete. Europe really has its work cut out for itself, especially when it comes to state support on electricity costs to plug the gap of the OPEX issue that we have, and also leveraging the public procurement side. I think Europe is leaving a big opportunity untouched for the moment by not accelerating the green public procurement as a stable demand side. Yeah. So that's the menu, and it's a matter of just completing this picture. And that is also what we're hoping to see in the next years, because Europe is planning to launch soon this EU Solar PV Industrial Alliance, which is meant to create this integrated strategy. It's going to be launched very soon, in a couple of weeks, the 9th of December. The objective is indeed to look at 30 gigawatts by 2025 across the value chain. And its main function is to be a business investment platform, to be a matchmaker between producers and off-takers, to create the right conditions for investment in large-scale PV and de-risk and accelerate industrial projects. And also to map all of the financial support and funds that do exist in Europe, but that are just a bit scattered and not used optimally. Let me also say that the membership to that alliance is open to everybody, all public and private entities with relevant activities or proven interest in the area of solar PV manufacturing in Europe. So feel free to join, take that into account. The moment it is launched, you are able to apply for membership as a company. And from a governance point of view, we at Solar Power Europe will be in the steering committee of the alliance, together with some other players and the European Commission, of course, who is the main organizer. Yeah. But there's, of course, a key question. Is this fast enough and is this big enough, especially in light with international competition that I was talking about, and in light of the fact that Europe needs to act quick and big if it doesn't want to miss the boats on some of the manufacturing dynamics that we are seeing. So just in conclusion, solar is and will be the leading pillar for energy supply in Europe much sooner and much faster than many people think. And I think the same applies elsewhere in Europe. The solar boom is quite spectacular. So that's why the European Union needs a comprehensive solar manufacturing strategy. The key will be the financing, CapEx and OpEx, and stable demand. But therefore, we are still in conversations with the European Commission and making the point that something else is needed, something additional is needed. Europe needs to step up and create a visible, large and dedicated support scheme, not to risk missing the boat. We are working on a lot of suggestions for that. For example, learning from India, learning from the US, thinking, for example, on EU-wide tenders for PV manufacturing based on a similar kind of euro per watt's peak support. And there's a key role for the public banks as well, the European Investment Bank and other national public banks. So that's where we hope to see progress in the next months. And then we can be hopeful that in Europe will be joining quite clearly this diversification of solar manufacturing around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dries. And I think learning from each other, that is very much what International Solar Alliance is all about. And we hope that people can learn from all the examples around the world today. And with that, I'd like to invite Rodrigo Pedroso from AB Solar, which is Brazil's Solar Association, to share kind of his perspective on what is happening in Brazil. And why don't you introduce yourself while I get the presentation ready?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Alexander. It's very proud for AB Solar to be in COP27 and to be here in this presentation for ISA as well. Just when he starts to fix the presentation, I will introduce myself and AB Solar. I'm a civil engineer. I work on the Brazilian electric sector over the last 20 years. I'm on the solar sector since 2012, when we started the legislation and the regulation about solar sector in Brazil. And I'm also a co-founder of a Brazilian energy company called Pacto Energia Group that works on generation, transmission, trade, and energy distribution as well. And where's that? No. Okay. It's okay. Okay. And okay. And about AB Solar, we promote the solar PV sector in Brazil and abroad. We yes. Okay. And this we serve as the sector meeting ground and focal point on debates. We have presence on all Brazilian states and the federal district as well. And we have national and abroad companies working, join the AB Solar. Okay. 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 About the capacity in Brazil, our annual installed capacity in 2021, Brazil was the 50th country that has more installed solar PVs, about 5.5 gigawatts. And in a cumulative installed capacity, Brazil is not yet on the top 10 countries. We started the year on the 14th place. Nowadays, we are around 13. And I think on the end of the year, or at least the beginning of the next year, Brazil will be on the top 10 countries in cumulative installed capacity. Just to know, Brazil, it's increasing our capacity over 1 gigawatt per month on the last months. About our electrics matrix, we have a 200 megawatts of installed capacity. About 60.2% is by hydro. It's our main electric metric energy on the electric matrix. The second one is wind with 10%, and solar, it's around 9.7. So I think even until the end of the year, or at least at the beginning of the next year, solar will cross wind power and be the second on the electric matrix of Brazil. As I said, Brazil, it's on solar, we have more than 20 gigawatts right now on installed capacity. About our solar value chain, we have companies for all the value chain. We have PV modules manufacturing in the state of São Paulo. We have manufacturing fixed structures in state of São Paulo as well. We have a tracker industry. We have PV inverters factory in the state of Santa Catarina. And about our value chain, it's the companies, how many companies you have in Brazil. On solar PV systems, it's the companies that assembled the kits and sell it, over 80 companies. On inverters, we have nine industries, on trackers 8, on modules 8 as well, and on batteries 1 string box. Those companies are the companies that are listed on BNDES. BNDES is the National Bank for Development in Brazil. It's a government bank that finance national equipments, national industries in Brazil. As you can see here, is not too much company besides our capacity installed and our potential of growth. And Brazil is trying to push more companies and more industry to install their facilities in Brazil as now. A very big point to increase this policy and increase this growth of industries in Brazil, it's that Brazil has a competitive advantage in manufacture of PV companies due lower CO2 emissions, because as you know, on the last slide, we have a renewable electric matrix. More than 85% of our electric matrix comes from renewable. And manufacturing PV companies for sure would emit from 40 to 80% less than CO2 that in Asia, comparing to Asia. So it's a very big opportunity to decarbonize this industry around the world. About the solar production chain, the structural measures, we want to implement and competitive sustainable value chain for the photovoltaic sector to maintain and consolidate the state-of-art factories around the country, balancing charges and taxes, reduce electricity and logistics costs, rationalize the tax burden on jobs and raw materials. Main strategic measures, we want to develop new competitive finance lines. It's a big challenge in Brazil right now for small, medium, large projects, for individuals and corporations, and in urban and rural areas, valuing our products, national products. About our proposal to create a demand, solar PV should correspond at least 70% of the total of the electric meter contracted between the solar PV and wind in future auctions. It's something that we are proposing. Work with state governments to create demand, because why state government? Because in Brazil have different laws and different regulations from each state. So we have 26 states, so we have different 26 kinds of laws and kinds of incentives that each state can provide to solar industries. Preference to equipment with FINAM. FINAM is the code that the equipment has when they are built in Brazil facilities. So we can have a FINAM code, and you can finance with incentives from BNDES, the National Bank of Development. Development a program between Mercosur countries, so we can export PV parts to all over Latin America and Mercosur countries, and development a specific industrial policy for the solar PV sector. Taxonomy, equalize the tax conditions for modules and other PV equipments through reduction of raw materials or tax incentives products made in Brazil. So we can compete with abroad products as well. We have some instruments that are doing it right now. It calls PADIS, ICMS agreement. ICMS is the state taxes that we have in Brazil. So we have, as I said, 26 states plus the federal district. So we have different kinds of ICMS and state laws. Our associates, AB Solar, as I said, the association, we started on 2012 with only 9 companies on that time. Nowadays, we are almost 1,000 companies, all those kinds of companies, from individuals, researchers, for developers, industries, banks, national companies, international companies, everything we have as our associates in Brazil. You are very welcome to join us and know about our associates. Here you have a QR code if you want to know more about AB Solar. And thank you for your attention. I'm here to explain and answer some questions if you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, and please do take a chair. So with that, we'll move on to the panel. I think we've had some excellent examples from India and Australia and Brazil. And with that, I'd like to invite my panelists to join the stage, starting with Mr. Chintan Shah, who's the technical director at the Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency. Dr. Nicole Cooper Russell, the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of FIBE. We have Eric Quiring, the Director of Global Public Affairs at SMA Solar Technology, and I'd ask Dries to join the panel as well. So firstly, thank you very much for your presentation, Rodrigo and Dries. I think it was extremely productive. And now I wanted to turn the floor over to Mr. Chintan Shah to speak a little bit about the role of financing. I mean, manufacturing is very expensive, as we all know, especially ingots, wafers, cells. I just wanted to get a better understanding of how India is approaching the financing of manufacturing.
Am I audible? Yeah, Alex, thanks. India has definitely opened up a big platform for manufacturing the entire solar value chain. But the advantage with India is we already created a market for it first. We have a deployment market, which is a big one. So from the banker's perspective, if somebody is coming up with manufacturing units in India, because we can see inherent market, which has been there backed by the government's targets. Our target is about 500 gigawatt of renewables by 2030. And if you take only solar, talking about 280 gigawatt by 2030, it's a sizable market. And because of which that there's a push also from the government side to push more and on manufacturing for two reasons. One is obviously you can't be dependent on value chain, which got disrupted in the last 2 years. I've been seeing that, and what happened in India is even most of the bids that had been brought out 2 years back doesn't make any commercial sense today because the commodity prices have gone up. So it's a very sensible move that the government has pushed towards manufacturing. And yes, we do have the production link incentive, the policy that was brought by the government to incentivize high efficiency solar photovoltaic modules to be manufactured across the value chain, right from sand till the modules. Apart from that, there's a huge amount of ancillary that which is coming up. Apart from the value chain of solar, you have the glass industry, you have the inverter industry. So the entire ecosystem is getting now created in India. From the banker's perspective, as a banker, most of the bankers are now okay in financing solar manufacturing. Yes, there are certain due diligence that the bankers would always do in terms of the quality of the promoter, the strength of the sponsor. But otherwise, from the market perspective, I don't think there's a problem. The major problem that was on capital cost benchmarks and efficiency benchmarks, which I think as IREDA, we have played a major role in financing first of the projects. And so we ourselves assess the entire capital cost benchmarks, the performance benchmarks. So we now know more or less what is the cost of manufacturing, what is the economics of manufacturing. Rather, IREDA was the first banker to finance solar cell manufacturing about 2 years back. When the entire world was not looking at manufacturing in India, somebody came up with an idea and we supported the idea, and that particular manufacturing is up and running now. But now we see that bulk of the bankers and most of the manufacturing that is coming up in India is in the range of 1 gigawatt size or 2 gigawatt size, which is nowadays a mid-size manufacturing for solar. We have very large players in India with a very large, strong corporate background, which may not find much of an issue of rearranging debt. But I think the mid-sized players, they require a fair amount of debt, and which I think now the ecosystem is there in India to finance it. But what is important is maybe learnings from this can be documented so that ISA countries can also adopt in certain other developing countries of how this entire thing got created in India. And why not? If you can replicate it in other countries, why reinvent the wheel and also learn from our mistakes? Because we also have committed mistakes while financing. So we'll be quite open to share our ideas, share our experience, so that other countries which is planning to roll out local manufacturing or local solar policy can take our inputs. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Mr. Shah. I look forward to the joint IREDA ISA work on the playbook for financing a solar manufacturing abroad. We've been talking a lot about the ecosystem. You know, you mentioned the jobs. We talked about carbon earlier. Both Rodrigo and Dries mentioned carbon. So I was hoping, Nicole, you could bring in kind of that perspective on that kind of more holistic aspects of the manufacturing and deployment, and how we can ensure that it's a win-win for all segments of society.
Thanks, Alex, for that question. So I represent 5B, which is an innovative technology startup. We're scaling prefabricated, rapidly deployed solar solutions. So we deploy a megawatt in a day with only 10 people, and we're going to 10x that within a year again. So really focusing on speed. I know everyone's kind of talking about speed and how quickly we can get some of these numbers that we've seen kind of up and running. I think one of the questions that was raised in the last panel, which really hit home for us, was it's not just the what, but also the how. So we are embedding design for recyclability right from the get-go into our product. We're going through cradle to cradle accreditation, B Corp accreditation. We have a reconciliation action plan with First Nations people in Australia. We're working very proactively with Indigenous companies to support them to become ecosystem partners of ours, because I think one of the most exciting things about this transition is that there's enormous potential and capacity to bring people along the journey. So we have deployment partners in the north of Australia that are Indigenous owned and operated companies. We have a company, a manufacturing company in Adelaide that has transitioned from automotive manufacturing to solar manufacturing. So there's all of this industry that we can harness and take on the journey with us, which I think is super exciting.
All right, thanks so much, Dr. Nicole. I really appreciate that perspective. And I think this is something, as we're developing manufacturing, we really need to think about how we're impacting communities and all these other groups. And with that, I want to turn over to Eric now. You know, we talk a lot about cost and low cost manufacturing, but we also talk about resilience. We also talk about quality, end of life recyclability, as Nicole just mentioned. So I was wondering if you could share SMA's perspective on how do we ensure that we're manufacturing not just for the lowest cost, but to take into account some of these other factors.
Thank you. Yeah, quality is very interesting because quality is actually what the customer pays for. And this changed a bit in the last 20 years. So 10 years ago, everyone was okay, we just pay you for generating electricity. And this is what we did. And it's not a secret. You can build a solar power plant living 30 years. So everyone can do this. But right now it's changed a little bit. The customer's paying depends on the customer. Residential or large scale is different, but they're paying for the whole ecosystem. So they want you for the inverter power generation, but also for energy management, demand management. They want you to feed into the electric fleet of your company or of your electric EV charging at your house. And this is something you have also to ensure. And this is also what the customer sees as quality. If you can a smooth transition from one component to the other. And this is very different than just normal power electronics because it's more software related. And to right now increase our quality, we really have to hire a lot of people. So now we're hiring not engineers, we're hiring software developers, we're hiring user experience developers. And right now, one of the very interesting things I learned 2 weeks ago, we had a customer questionnaire. The color of your product is a game changer. So we developed like increasing technology, the best made in Germany quality, and say, okay, but does that fit to my Tesla? So this is what the customers pay for right now. And this is really different than 20 years ago. And to increase this, you need to invest in people. So we work a lot of times together with universities. We work together with research institutes. We have partnerships in software development. We have partnership also in app development. And this is actually the quality which counts right now. On the hardware quality, it's actually everything about the price. We do count in lifetime. We count in our very low footprint. We have a carbon-free emission manufacturer side. We have a carbon-free product. We work on the eco-design and think this will be a game changer worldwide. But right now we don't see a business opportunity for like a lifetime over 20 years. Even that's very sad. So there's different parts of quality, and with this growth, I really hope we can scale up the hardware quality.
So thanks so much, Eric. And I think, you mentioned the low carbon and the quality, and I hear, Rodrigo talking about, Brazil's ambitions, but they've got low carbon electricity production. So I guess the question I want to ask is how do we ensure SMA or other European companies or Nicole, how do we get them to Brazil? I'm using Brazil as an example here, but how do we get them to expand and to ensure that these technologies are deployed and manufactured around the world?
I might kick off and others I'm sure have perspectives. So we're an Australian-based company. We have about 150 people globally. We're expanding quite rapidly. And this year, next year, we're expanding into India and the US in terms of manufacturing. So I think for us, for any kind of global company, you look at policies in countries and you go to places that support you the most. And the US and India, as we've heard, they have stable, long-term, really well thought through policies that support demand, support local content, support local kind of loans for establishing manufacturing. So my perspective is it's not rocket science. It's been done by two large economies very successfully so far. And so I think now that we have the playbook, it's on other countries to look at that and say, okay, well, if they've done it, we can do it as well. And this is how we're going to do it.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a subsidiary in the Brazilian market. We are also a member of AB Solar. We don't have a manufacturer site there. And because right now the transport costs are very low globally. Yeah, so we had a peak. And we look also on those incentives and policy regulation. But the reason why we don't have a manufacturer site in Brazil is just because to reduce those complexity, we need a lot of knowledge. And we have all this knowledge because we're a German-based manufacturer. We have 40 years of experience. We have sold in the last 40 years over 130 gigawatts. We have to bring all those together. So we're very careful now setting up new manufacturer sites. So because we have the idea of having all this intelligence together, and right now having those incentives in the US or India can create a sense of deglobalization. So you have to produce in the US to sell in the US. And this could be very dangerous for a global climate crisis.
I think I fully agree with my panelists, but what I would like to tell over here is the policy has to have the KISS concept, that they call it keep it simple and stupid for everybody to understand. Don't make it complicated. And the second part is consistent. You might not have a great policy, may not have a great incentive, but be consistent in what you say and don't roll back, because that scares the equity investors. That's the key part to it. Because the markets can go up and down for a year or so, but a long-term policy framework should be sustained, constant. Now, one thing that comes to my mind over here is when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act of the US, they have not just touched the solar, they also touched the ecosystem. Very important. What people by and large may not know is the solar value chain only represents 60% of the cost of module. 40% comes from glass, from laminates, for EVA, backsheets, trackers, aluminum frames, lot many things. I think that also deserves a great importance, that you don't require great technologies there. It's a simple technology. Making glass is not a great technology. Everybody manufactures it. Float glass is manufactured across the world. But unless you don't touch that part, you can't get the final product, which is the solar module. I think IRA, the US Act actually gets into that also. They got incentive for trackers, for glasses, for aluminum frames, everything. That means they want to create an entire ecosystem. That is also one of the reasons that China is able to champion this thing, because the entire ecosystem is in place. You just cannot manufacture polysilicon in isolation. No. You require polysilicon, you require ingots, you require wafer, cells, modules, and the ancillaries. I think that's the way one has to look at it. And I think Brazil has a great program of FINAME, where essentially you incentivize people to go for localization. So, but I think FINAME also has a problem because it is fixed in terms of the amount of subsidy available, which also restricts the market. So I think that's some innovation Brazil also needs to do. To that way, India is quite open in terms of investments coming in. Yes, We've been, as India, we've been seeing a huge amount of equity investment getting into manufacturing now. We've been seeing certain global funds giving equity investments into manufacturing, which was not happening till now. But now I think the belief in the government's policy is so high that the equity investment started coming up in manufacturing. It used to come in projects. Now it's coming in manufacturing, which is a great positive. That means people by and large think this is a long-term consistent policy. And why not? Because solar is going to be the cheapest source of power in the future. Everybody knows it. In policy or no policy, it's going to happen. It's a matter of time. So the whole idea is that how can you push it? Policy definitely gives a nudge. What things might not be happening 10 years down the line would happen in 5 years. That's the only time difference that the policies will bring in. And then that's what it matters. And I think across the world, the governments are very keen to push local manufacturing in a big way.
Something very important I want to say about Brazil. We did in the past a very good politic about nationalized products in wind farm, in wind sector. When wind starts in Brazil, the government say that we need to use all national parts and national equipments. So all the brands comes to, and all the industries comes to Brazil. And then we come to start solar industry in Brazil. As our colleague from Europe said, the government and the states try to push the deployment of the solar sector and not about the manufacturers. So right now, I think it's the way that we need to look for our local industries, because Brazil is growing up very fast, exponentially, as all you know knows. And one more thing about Brazil, very important in my point of view right now, Brazil is being positioned as the biggest green hydrogen producer in the world. So we need to produce this green hydrogen through renewable sources. And solar probably, as he said right now, if you believe or not, solar will be the biggest resources to produce the green hydrogen. So we need to be not dependent from the other countries' production, not because it's China or other countries, because we cannot be on a hand of only one country and one of only supplier. So Brazil needs to think straight about it. And I think the government will try to look about this manufacturers say, and do as India and the United States is doing right now with good policies and good regulations to incentivize this.
Thanks so much. And I've got one more question from me before I turn over to the audience. But so we had a lot of great discussion about Brazil and India and Europe and Australia. But I noticed on the carbon, there's a chart with the carbon list of the countries by the carbon production. And the very right end was actually Ethiopia, because they're predominantly a hydropowered economy. So now I'm just kind of curious, I know, Eric, you mentioned, SMA, it's a big investment. So maybe inverters aren't the right place to start. But, Mr. Shaw, you mentioned 40% of the materials, it's glass, it's backsheet, it's encapsulants. So for smaller countries that don't necessarily have the resources of the United States with the IRA or India with the PLI scheme, where do they start? Can they start doing some aspects locally? And I wouldn't mind if you started, and I'd also like your perspective as well, Joyce.
I think definitely certain introspection is required on this, because a particular country might have facilities to localize a couple of things. Now that ranges from a country to country, maybe at a regional level also. If they're very small countries, they'll be normally will have a cooperation, like in Asia, you have the ASEAN region, the SAARC region. Similarly, you'll have certain cooperation like this in Micronesia or Asia or even to that matter Africa. I think that is something a very localized way of looking at things. But I think it's possible, apart from the module manufacturing, a lot of other things can be localized. I think that should not be left out, because otherwise we'll end up importing all these things, which might add a cost to it. And it is a very critical part of it. You might have the cell available, you have the glass available, you don't have a backsheet. Now, what do you do with your solar module? It's incomplete. So I think these are small values, but important values, adds up to this entire thing. So whoever is trying to draft a localization policy should be actually getting into the bills of material, as we call it, bombs. The bomb list will be created, and is this particular bomb list needs to be looked into. How do you attack this part also? And I'm telling you, this 40% portion actually is very, very labor intensive. So it also helps in creating employment. That is something, an advantage that you have. So that's one thing I would like to say. And
yeah, I don't think the intention is for everyone to do what the US and India are doing. It's impossible, right? Like they are enormous economies with enormous, and China has obviously gone before and done it very successfully. So I think the trick is, and as kind of Peter Fart said on the previous panel, figuring out what element of that value chain makes sense in your country, and most critically, supporting demand for solar, because that's the thing, or solar, wind, renewables in general, supporting uptake, because that is what will drive manufacturing to a local point. And if you start with the module encapsulation and work backwards, or if glass makes a lot of sense in your geography, then wonderful, but you don't need to do all of it all at once.
Just one thing I want to mention, and I want to strengthen what you said before, investment security. I think it's much more important than incentives. And I mean, the US started in just August. Before there, they have IPC and PTCs changed every 2 years. So this was not a great security for your investment. And I think the most interesting thing about Germany was that we had a stabilized contract for 20 years. So small countries can give loans for long-term PPAs to increase a very stable market. I think this will be helped much more than incentivization like the US has right now.
Yes, and I just wanted to add the dimension of what you're referring to in terms of CO2 footprint and sustainability. Because I think that's important for manufacturing in the rest of the world as well. I mean, in the first place, as was said before, this is for your own domestic market. So leveraging the demand pool is the first thing that you should be doing. But if you plan to export to Europe, you really need to take into account the new rules around eco-design, circularity, repairability, and the CO2 footprint of the panels, because that will be a prerequisite to be able to import into Europe. And it starts with eco-design in terms of, this is the minimum rules that you have to comply with to be able to import, but then it will grow to an eco-label, and an eco-label is to reward the best performing sustainable solar panels. So you basically have both a push out and a pull in of high quality, high sustainable solar panels. So I think that's probably, to the extent that is possible, a niche to look at in terms of having a competitive advantage for imports into Europe.
Thanks so much, Dries. And I should note that as the International Solar Alliance, we are working through Clean Energy Ministerial, ideally to harmonize some of these standards. I mean, hopefully as a manufacturer exporter, it's not one rule for Europe and one rule for US and one rule for India, one rule for Africa, but ensuring that that we have a common set of standards around carbon, around recyclability and end of life, and all these other very important factors. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to the audience if anybody has any questions for the panelists. Okay, go ahead.
Ok, donc nous remercions donc les panélistes. Donc ma question va au niveau du présentateur au niveau de l'Europe. Je crois ils sont ouverts pour la rentrée de tout un chacun de leur groupe. Est-ce qu'ils ne pensent pas que l'Europe s'est enfermée, donc contrairement à l'ISA, donc ils sont enfermés, donc maintenant les Africains, est-ce que vous avez accès pour rentrer dans votre comment, quelles sont les procédures, est-ce que ça n'est pas difficile, dur comme faire pour pouvoir avoir accès à vous, parce que c'est une sorte de vous avez fait, comment vous allez arranger ça. Merci.
Merci. Et moi, ma question, j'aimerais la poser aux deux premiers intervenants. Au niveau de la production des équipements d'énergie solaire, vous savez, la qualité doit être de mise. Et l'Afrique souffre des équipements qui ne sont pas de bonne qualité. Est-ce que l'ISA peut faire l'effort pour qu'on puisse avoir un centre de production des équipements solaires pour l'Afrique en répondant à toutes les normes et toutes les qualités possibles? Et cela va contribuer vraiment au déploiement possible et l'accès aux équipements d'énergie solaire. Donc, je demande comment ça peut accepter vraiment cette approche.
Can I go on? Can I? Okay.
Did you speak French, so why don't you go first and then we'll go from there. Yeah. Did you guys figure this out or no?
Merci beaucoup pour la question. Je pense que c'est on parle un peu français ou d'autres langues aussi dans ce panel. Mais peut-être pour le reste, peut-être je continue en anglais. Continue in English for the sake of the wider understanding. So thank you very much for the question. The first question was related to me with respect to the European Solar PV Alliance and to what extent that is accessible and for different groups. So the European Commission is ultimately deciding who is in and who's not. But the criteria that they apply is defined in a very broad terms. The point is that you need to have a proven interest in towards the objective of the alliance is to accelerating and growing solar PV manufacturing in Europe. That's the main criteria. Now, of course, I didn't catch which organization you're representing, but I think in terms of public entities, this will of course be limited to European governments or European countries. But when it comes to companies, the whole intention of the alliance is to go very wide, because that's the dynamic that they're looking for. So happy to pick this up. And then there was a second question, but I think you need to repeat that a second, because I don't know who you were addressing it to. So if I may ask you to repeat, maybe.
C'est pour dire que je viens du Niger, République du Niger.
La deuxième question va aux fabricants, aux firmes fabricants des équipements à énergie solaire.
I'll try to fix this. We'll go on. Keep it,
Well, I must say that I'm excited about the discussion so far. There's a particular question that I need to ask. I come from a community in Nigeria which is interested in establishing a solar farm. The community has given 200 acres of land to our partners. The partners are from the UK, and we have established a joint venture company. Now, the government doesn't have the funds to support this project, but the government has licensed the land. We're supposed to pay a huge amount to have the certificate of occupancy for the land. So the government said we should pay 10% of that huge amount. So the remaining will be the equity for the government. Now the community owns the land, and that's the equity. Unfortunately, our partners are dragging their feet in the investment process. And I'm here to ask, how do we go about it? The community is ready, the land is ready, it is licensed, it's been surveyed, the market is there, the government is happy about it because of the impact on about 500,000 people, and the tax is going to derive from people getting busy, having energy to do their businesses. So I need an advice or a contact to whom I can talk on behalf of the community to move the process forward. Thank you.
Please.
We'll answer that question and then we'll come back to it.
I think you have two problems. One is lack of proper public policy in Nigeria, and because of which the financing becomes a problem. There are two things to it. As far as financing is concerned, I would suggest, Nigeria, you need to approach the local bank. It's a small project, 200 acres, maybe around 50 to 60 megawatts. Not a big size project. Doesn't make sense to go for overseas funding. It has to be a localized funding. Makes a great sense over there. But this can only happen if the public policy is in place. Otherwise, the viability of the project, you cannot establish for financing. So that's what my take is.
I don't have a strategic advice, but I give you my card. Our CEO is from Nigeria, so we have a foundation there. So very easy for us to handle this.
Merci beaucoup. Malheureusement, je n'ai pas assisté au panel. J'ai été interpellée par une chose, c'est que je ne vois pas dans cette alliance. Parce que si c'est une alliance pour le solaire, c'est que chez moi, avec une superficie de plus d'1 million de kilomètres désertique, là, tous les 12 mois de l'année, il y a le vent. Donc, je voudrais bien qu'on rejoigne cette alliance. Merci. Voilà.
Quel pays? Which country are you from? Mauritania. Okay. It's not here. Okay. Yeah, no, yes, we're very open to countries to join. My colleague Shashir would be the expert on the joining process, but effectively you sign it and then you ratify it, and we're very happy to have new member countries join. We just had United States and Bhutan join just last month. Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? Any other questions online? Okay. Did we have any final remarks that our panelists want to share with the group, kind of giving a broad overview? Or should I conclude? Yes, sure, go ahead.
I think one really important thing to keep in mind is what all of this looks like at a terawatt or 2 or 4 terawatts of scale. Our technology is based around automation, prefabrication. We generate twice the amount of energy per area of land in any given space. So it's about thinking through bottlenecks and what are we going to run out of: people, land, grid connection points, materials, and really thinking about that in a very futuristic way and kind of working back from that. So with all of the policies that are developed, I would just say, keep in mind technology, innovation, and be open to that, and don't have policies that kind of limit the ability to innovate and go towards a terawatt per annum, which is absolutely where we need to be.
Thanks so much. I think it's very clear. I just want to conclude with some kind of key themes. I think certainly the importance of demand. So something ISA is certainly trying to promote is getting the demand side right, getting the projects, ensuring countries have ambitious solar targets. I think also we talked a lot about this ecosystem approach, how, you know, we want to talk about, you know, carbon, and we want to talk about social aspects. We want to talk about recyclability. We want to talk about end of life. This is very important to kind of get this whole picture. And then finally, I think one of the key messages that I took away from this was certainly that there are different niches that different countries can take. Not everybody is going to have the same resources as in India or as the United States, but that doesn't mean there's not opportunities to start in specific aspects. So I really appreciate all the panelists for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and sharing your wisdom. And I thank our audience for joining us as well. And with that, I will close, and I would invite you to our session at 5 p.m. on a discussion around the solar facility. Thank you so much. Wait, before you go, can I get a picture of the panel? I just realized my